The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. It's wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces. This webinar is all about forging solutions to the problems of human violence and animal violence. It's my honor to be your moderator. My name is Julie Grant. I'm a host at Court TV. I was a prosecuting attorney some time ago, and I have had the pleasure of working with Grace Coleman and being one of the advisors on the Pause for Empowerment board. So that program is near and dear to my heart, and on behalf of everyone at Crisis Center North, we want to welcome you to this webinar. I want to introduce all of our panelists and then turn things over to Grace for some very special thank yous. So I mentioned Grace Coleman, who is the Executive Director of Crisis Center North, is on the panel. I mean, I'm telling you what, this is a power panel if I've ever seen one. Along with Grace, we have Dana Friday. She is an attorney. She is the Pause for Empowerment Coordinator at Crisis Center North as well. We have with us Nikki Thompson. She is the Chief Humane Society Officer of Bucks County, Pennsylvania's SPCA. We have with us Nancy Blaney, who is the Director of Governmental Affairs of the Animal Welfare Institute. We have Sarah Manos. She is a teacher, activist, domestic violence survivor, and one of the Pause for Empowerment Advisory Board members as of recently. We're so delighted to have her on the board. And we have another panelist we're hoping who can hop on. She's having some tech issues with her computer. Her name is Kristen Tulo. She is the PA State Director of the Humane Society of the United States. So as I said, a power panel. I'm so happy to have all of these remarkable, brilliant women answering your questions today and hopefully forging those solutions to these problems. So before we get underway, thank you for attending, and I want to turn it over to my friend Grace Coleman for some special thank yous. Grace.
Thank you, Julie. I'd like to welcome everyone and just also send a thanks to our funders at the Pittsburgh Foundation and also at OVC through the Department of Justice, who have been important partners in our quest to forge solutions for human and animal abuse. I'd also like to acknowledge the KeystoneLINK members from the coalition that are not here today on the panel, and that includes Amy Kunis, Teresa Olson, Kathleen Palm, Heather Rozzi, Leslie Slingsby, and Jim Wilshire. So thank you so much for the support from afar, and I look forward to chatting with you all at the next coalition meeting. So I'll turn it back over to you, Julie.
Oh, Grace, thank you so much. So here's what we're going to do today. Here's a little bit of a preview. I know I always did better in class when I had a little bit of an outline or kind of a syllabus, a roadmap. As a trial attorney, we like roadmaps when we give opening statements. So today we're going to really talk about three things. We're going to talk about the problem, the intersection between human violence and animal violence. We're going to talk about how this problem impacts survivors of domestic violence, their companion animals. And then also, we're going to talk about solutions. We have people who arguably know so much more than most people about these issues. And so we're tapping the best of the best to help us with the solutions and what we can do better as a society, as individuals, to help ourselves, help people we love. Because really, let's be honest, domestic violence is a problem that affects everybody. That hasn't happened to us personally, it's happened to someone we know and love. And people often don't talk about it because it's hard to talk about. So we're gonna do what's tough today. We're gonna talk about it. And just wanna say, please practice really good self-care during this webinar. I mean, always practice good self-care. But I wanna warn you, some of the things we're gonna talk about could be triggering. They could bring up issues if you're a DV survivor or if someone close to you has been affected by it. So just kind of know that we're diving into some tough stuff here, and we want you to be cognizant of your own mental health and care. And we're going to have hotline numbers up for you throughout the webinar, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. That number you should see on your screen, and also Crisis Center North, always available to you as well. So that number is there too. So please avail yourself of those resources. And at the end, we're going to make time for all of our panelists to answer your questions as well. So without any further ado, let's talk about the problem. Grace Coleman, I want to talk to you first, please. about that intersection between domestic violence, human violence. How pervasive is animal abuse, in your opinion, within the context of domestic violence?
I think it's extremely pervasive within that context, Julie. And in a recent survey that was done, over 71% of domestic violence victims had indicated that not only were they experiencing the abuse, but their pets were experiencing the abuse as well. And so I think what's really important to think about is that whenever there is animal abuse, it's a predictor of other forms of abuse. And generally when animal abuse is present, child abuse can be present as well as intimate partner violence. And so I think it's really important to focus on that intersectionality, because when you take a look at these pieces, what we realize is that historically animal abuse has been kind of siloed and thought of as an issue on its own. And part of what we're trying to do at the Keystone Link is stress that intersectionality.
I appreciate it so much, Grace. Nancy Blaney, I want to go to you next, if I may, please. The Animal Welfare Institute has been a real leader on this issue nationally, really since the 1950s. So kudos to you and all of your colleagues there. And if you would, please talk about some of the factors that prompted AWI to really recognize that link that was going on between the animal abuse and the human abuse, if you would.
Thanks, Julie. It's really what Grace was talking about, that kind of what you know intuitively, that people who abuse animals are likely to abuse people and vice versa. But really about 30, 35 years ago was when the research began to support that. And the research has been pretty uniform across the decades that, as Grace mentioned, 71% of domestic violence victims have reported that their animals have been targeted as well. We've also found that people who abuse animals are 5 times more likely to commit other crimes. 50% of individuals, or actually 70% of individuals who have been convicted of animal abuse go on to commit other crimes, and 40% of them are violent. So the research is there, and that's what really prompted us to say, we have a problem. How do we reach out and work with our domestic violence partners to address this so that everyone can make it to safety?
Isn't that the truth? Nancy, thank you so much for that. Dana Friday, let me go to you next, if I may, please. So you are a legal advocate. You're the PAWS coordinator. You are in the trenches, so to speak, seeing cases playing out in our court system day in and day out. Talk to us, if you would, please, about how you've seen family pets used as weapons by those people who use violence as a means of coercive control.
Yeah, Julie, it is heartbreaking. Some of the things that we actually see one-on-one, which will be so great to talk to Sarah. But our pets are part of our family. We love and care for them. So an abuser understands this, and in order to control the person, he'll use the animal. We had a client in a hospital who was severely beaten while in the hospital, asked to see her cell phone. Opens the cell phone, and there's her husband strangling her dog, saying, "This is what's going to happen to you." Mm-hmm. We had another client in court who had 2 dogs. They had an abusive relationship for a while. The perpetrator would say that he was just going to leave the dog's fence in the yard gate open for the dog to escape. And of course, it was constant communication. They had an argument. After the argument, the client went and took a shower, came out of the shower, and when she came out, her husband said, "Oh, I don't know what happened. I took the dog outside and somehow he suddenly died." So these are forms of intimidation. And the case in the court was not about the dog. However, but later there was physical abuse to that client. Mm. So those are some of the cases that we have seen, and just as Nancy had said, and Grace, that was a predictor for that previous abuse to the animals, and threatening the animals was a predictor for later abuse of the person.
Dana, it's heart-wrenching. We all know that. Everyone participating on this webinar knows that it is heart-wrenching. It is unfair. And we know that domestic violence isn't about anger management. It's about power and control. And Dana, when you see these court cases playing out, and for those, we know folks all over the country, even all over the world, are joined in on this webinar right now. In Pennsylvania, where the PAWS program is based, the canine court advocates, Penny, Ari, and Rune, will accompany survivors to court to help them face their batterers. Not an easy thing to do. It requires so much courage. What obstacles do you see victims facing when they go to court in a situation where their pet has been used as a weapon against them?
There is a great amount of ignorance in the court system about this link between animal and human abuse, which causes a lot of problems with the court system. Not only the clients, but the court. And then also there's ignorance of services that are available to help these parties get through this and figure out ways to take their animal out of the cruel situation. There is a lack of compassion for animal ownership. We'll be in the court and the court says, I mean, all the court people will say, why are we talking about this animal when this victim was assaulted? There is a refusal to add the companion animals to orders, even when the abuse and intimidation is known. And Pennsylvania law considers pets to be personal property, not a beloved family member, which they are. So this viewpoint really discounts the importance of the pet to the victim, and it ignores the fact of the abuser using that victim's love for the pet against the victim. And as you said, to control that victim. So a lot of that ignorance really needs to be rectified, and education like this kind of webinar is extremely important in helping to forge a solution, as we have stated.
You're so right, Dana. That's exactly why we're talking about, because it's hard to talk about and it's hard to understand. You know, I'll be the first one, to admit these cases frightened me so much when I first got a glimpse of them, becoming a prosecutor. And I tried to learn as much as I could from people who know far more than I do about them, just to understand better and to try to be part of that solution that is our goal today. I mean, we want everybody who's on this webinar to walk away with great information that you can use to help yourself, to help other people, to try to be part of the movement to prevent it. Officer Nikki Thompson, I want to go to you next, please, and really tap into your expertise when it comes to reporting animal abuse to authorities. When somebody sees it and they make a report, you're in the trenches, you're seeing the reports come in, you're responding to them. What are the problems that you see come up when it comes to just the reporting, the making the call of these problems, please?
So a lot of times when people call in to report that their animal is being abused by, whether it's somebody living in their household or even just somebody visiting the household, a lot of times they're not taken seriously, especially if they go to their municipal police, because they have other things on their head. They think, it's an animal. It's really not that big of a deal. The other problem is that animals can't tell you what's going on. They can show you, injury, but it's hard to see bruising. It's hard to understand. Sometimes a fearful behavior isn't because of abuse, it's just because of lack of socialization. So when you go in and you look at that and you say, is that because it's been abused, because it's been hit or punished in some way, or is that just the natural behavior of the animal? I do think the biggest thing, though, is that people are not always taken seriously. I've had several cases in my career where I knew there was a problem. And before Pennsylvania had our newest animal cruelty laws passed that went through in, I think, 2017, we only had summary offenses that humane officers were able to do through shelters. The rest of the cases, if they went above that, they were misdemeanor or felony charges, would have to be done through a police department. And a lot of the detectives didn't take things seriously. I had a case where a man had a history of beating dogs, killing puppies, and was hiding the fact that he was beating his new girlfriend's dog. But she gained the evidence and took it to the police, and they said, no, there's nothing we can do. And I said, don't let it go. And we didn't let it go, and he was convicted for a second time, and did do jail time for it. But I think if it's happening, just make sure that it's continually reported until something happens. Find somebody who will listen to you and make an investigation begin.
Yes, persistence is key. You heard it from the officer. Be persistent, and then hopefully those reporting are going to encounter someone like you, Officer Nikki, when they make a report. They're going to be believed. And for anybody wondering, I had a couple viewers, Court TV viewers in the United Kingdom, reach out and want to join on the webinar. I hope you were on this webinar. If you're wondering, a summary offense, you heard the officer mention that, you could liken that to like a traffic ticket. Like, this is very, very low. So let that sink in. You know, when we think about the importance given, it's really, really stunning. And we are still hoping that Kristen Tulo will be able to join on again. She's still having those tech issues, but when she joins on, I'm definitely going to bring her in for a question. But this is really, we know this is a problem. There's a big link. We know it exists between the human abuse, the animal abuse, but what is the impact? How does it affect survivors of domestic violence? How does it affect their animals? We have a very special panelist to answer that question. I want to bring in Sarah Manos now. Sarah is a teacher. As I mentioned, she is an activist. She is a strong DV survivor and advocate for animals. And I want to just kind of reiterate my warning to all of you wonderful folks on this webinar. Some of what Sarah is going to share is probably going to be really tough to hear. You might want to get the tissues ready. You might want to just prepare yourself if you need to kind of step away for a second. We thank you for being on this webinar, and hope you can take something away from it. But just know that this is really an awful story. Sarah, the victimization that you and your sweet dogs experienced is unthinkable, yet it happened. Tell us about it, if you would.
Yes, so I experienced what a lot of experts have called one of the worst cases of abuse they've seen. And that's because in the 10 weeks that my abuser was with me, he killed both of my dogs, Kirby and Daisy, two little 19, 17-pound dogs, so little, fluffy, cute dogs. My dog Daisy was only 13 months old when he killed her. And it was extremely traumatic, and it started right away. He and I matched on Bumble on April 3rd of 2020. And the day after we started talking, he was threatening suicide and said he was going to kill himself, and said that I was the only thing that gave him hope, and said if I told anyone about it, that would guarantee he was going to kill himself. And so just me being in his life was keeping him alive. And then he told me that he saw something special in us, and that cycle of abuse started right away. And within days, he told me that his ex-girlfriend had disappeared by his family, that he had connections to the Russian mafia, that his dad was a US Marshal. And so it became a constant threat that he was going to kill my family if I did anything to disobey him.
Sarah, I mean, in listening to you share that, it's like, I'm in my mind, I keep thinking manipulator, right? I mean, shame on him, you know, right there, trying to control you, trying to, you know, again, like a typical batterer would, you know, trying to exert that control. And your dogs, so your sweet dogs, Kirby and Daisy, let's start there. Let's talk about what happened with them, because we know that, you know, it doesn't happen suddenly, or nobody would be with these people. I mean, it's like you heard the analogy, right? You know, how do you boil a frog? You very slowly, you turn up the temperature. And so it's like things happen over time, gradually. Let's start with the dogs, please.
Yes. So with my dog Daisy, I actually didn't know that it was a violent death until I had an autopsy done about 8 months after she died. And what happened with her was 3 weeks into me being with him, I was teaching a class on Zoom because it was at the start of the COVID pandemic. And he was in my bedroom with my dogs, Kirby and Daisy. And as I was teaching, I heard Daisy yelp. And I said, "Is everything okay?" And he came out and said, "Oh, Kirby was being rough with her." And I thought that was weird because Kirby was the gentlest creature you could ever know. And after my class ended a few minutes later, I went to be with them, and Daisy was very unwell. She couldn't walk. She was very out of it. My abuser would not let me near her at all. He was physically putting his body between me and Daisy. I did notice a blue bruise on the underside of her belly, and that was very startling to me because I had no idea how she could get a bruise. And at one point, I left the room as my abuser said he was caring for her because he said he was an EMT and had experience treating pets, and he was going to take care of her. And so I left the room and I came back and I walked in on him giving her an injection. And the look on his face, I knew I wasn't supposed to see that. And as soon as he gave her the injection, Daisy just deteriorated immediately. And she wouldn't respond when I would call her name. And my abuser wouldn't let me take her to the vet no matter how much I begged. And finally, he allowed me to take her. And when we went to the vet, he said, "Don't tell them about the injection I gave because otherwise they won't be able to treat her." And Daisy died very quickly after that in the vet. And 8 months later, I found out that she died from blunt force trauma from a single kick, which makes sense as I reflected on it, that I heard her yelp and this 13-month-old baby died from the kick that he gave her.
Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. So that was Daisy. Kirby's death came later.
Yes. He started abusing Kirby early on in the bathtub specifically and would tell me that he was training Kirby. And he would beat Kirby and kind of slam him into the tub of the bathtub, obviously. And I want to talk a little bit, if it's okay, about the week after he killed Daisy to kind of give a snapshot of the abuse that I suffered. The day after he killed Daisy, he began threatening me and my life because I had told my ex-boyfriend that Daisy had passed away and we had owned her together. And he said that I was cheating on him and said that his dad, the U.S. Marshal, was going to come over and kill me for telling my ex that Daisy had died. And then 2 days after he killed Daisy, he had his German Shepherd, who was this big, really vicious dog, attack Kirby. And I remember just being on the floor, sobbing, screaming, "No, no, 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 no," begging him to stop and saying, "I can't lose Kirby too," because this was 2 days after Daisy. And then, again, this is the same week, 3 days after he killed Daisy, he was clipping Kirby's toenails and his claws, and he noticed that one of them started to bleed. And once he saw the one bleeding, he went and made sure every single claw was bleeding. And then he told me to go get salt to put in the toenails to make it stop, which I'm sure is a way to, ensure his suffering. And then that Friday after he killed Daisy, he strapped Kirby down to 2 plywood boards and shaved him so his skin was raw. And that was the day that I sent Kirby to live with my parents for his safety. And then a week to the day after he killed Daisy, my abuser used his dog to attack me. And my abuser pinned me down in like a bear hug and provoked his dog to attack me. And his dog bit me on my left side, and I still have scars from that. And when I was screaming and crying in pain, my abuser just flew into a rage that I was reacting that way and that I was having a problem with him and his dog. And that was just the week after he killed Daisy. And that just speaks to the horrific abuse that I suffered with him and my dogs too.
I know that what you just shared, I know is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that came, including, Kirby's death, right? He ultimately killed Kirby.
Yes. And that came at the end of the 10 weeks because that was the event that allowed me to escape, essentially. But on Tuesday, June 23rd of 2020, my abuser made me get my dog Kirby from my parents' house and bring him to his house. And right away, he started the abuse where he took Kirby up to give him a bath. And I heard Kirby screaming and yelling in pain, obviously. And when my abuser finally allowed me to be with Kirby, he took Kirby to a couch outside of the bathroom and was pinning him down and drying him off after the bath. And I noticed tufts of fur coming off of Kirby. And that was very shocking to me because in my mind, I was thinking, what could have happened that Kirby is losing fur? And then I noticed that the entire left side of Kirby's body was raw. Like the entire left side of his body had been burned and you could just see flesh. And he had his dog attack Kirby then, and I did everything I could to intervene and hold his dog back from attacking Kirby. And then he brought Kirby out to his backyard, and this is very graphic, I will, tell you, but he held Kirby up above his head, and he was about 6 feet tall, and then slammed Kirby onto the ground. And that was horrific to see. And when I screamed and yelled and reacted to that, my abuser yelled at me for being too sensitive. And then he picked Kirby up again and threw him one more time. And the abuse continued to a degree that I'm sure you can imagine, just horrifically. And then my abuser brought us to a pond in the area. And at this point, Kirby was not doing very well. And my abuser said, let's see if he can swim. And so he took Kirby down to the pond, and Kirby wasn't moving in the water. And so my abuser picked Kirby up and threw him a distance of about 6 to 8 feet into the water. And Kirby was wearing a choke collar that my abuser put on him. And he would drag Kirby back out of the water. And then Kirby wouldn't want to swim again, so my abuser would pick him and throw him back out into the water. And he did that about 6 times. And on the final time, I noticed that Kirby was losing his energy, and he came belly up, and my abuser snapped him out of the water, and in a weird, twisted way, performed CPR to bring Kirby back. And at that point, I began begging him to take Kirby to a vet. And my abuser insisted on hurting Kirby for another hour or so before he allowed me to take Kirby to a vet. And when we went to a vet, they found that Kirby had 3 broken ribs and was in a critical state, and said we need to go to an emergency room or an emergency vet. And my abuser obviously didn't want to let me do that. And so he took me to where he had parked my car that day, because he held me hostage in his car the entire day. And when I saw him driving past my car, I knew that this was bad. And he continued abusing Kirby after we had gone to the vet. And that was the moment that broke the trauma bond for me, to see that he was still hurting my dog after I had tried to get care for him. And so on the way back from an emergency vet that we had taken him to, Kirby was in my arms in the car and passed away in my arms in transit from one ER to another. And my family was aware of this at this point, and my dad was in contact with the vet because he took Kirby's body to a local veterinarian to get an autopsy done. And the vet told my dad, you need to call the police. Like, this was not a fall in the pond. It was not an accident. You need to call the police. And when my dad contacted the police, that was the closest my abuser has ever come to killing my dad. And I remember like standing in front of the door and begging my abuser not to go kill my dad because he was on his way. And that was the day after he killed Kirby. I made my first attempt at escape. And I wrote a letter that I was literally going to drop off at a grocery store so my mom could pick up the letter and my abuser wouldn't know where I was. but my abuser called me as I was finishing the letter, and I knew it wasn't safe to leave then. And so then that Thursday, June 25th, 2 days after he killed Kirby, I spent the day with him because I knew that that night I was going to escape. And then I packed my bags and I went to my parents' house and I disclosed everything to my family. And the next day we went to the courthouse and fled town after I got the emergency order of protection.
Sarah, I know that I speak for every one of the wonderful people on this webinar right now when I say we are so sorry you went through that. Your courage, your strength to tell that story today is nothing short of remarkable. And I hope you keep telling that story because that is like as bad as it can get. And I know that like, there's so much more. We're boiling it down for the sake of time. But I would just want to acknowledge your courage. And, you know, it was quite a process also for you to get justice. And I want to talk about that. And I also want to make sure we have time because I want to pick your brain about solutions as well, you know, to problems. But to kind of touch on the justice, I know the wheels of justice are still turning. So to kind of give everybody that headline, stay tuned. This guy's getting what's coming to him.
Yes.
But this was not easy for you, was it?
No, in fact, dealing with the system was very much re-traumatizing for me on a new level because the prosecutors refused to press charges. And the only thing that the county that I lived in did was they arrested him for violating the order of protection. And he pleaded guilty to that and was put on probation and had to pay a fine for it. But they did nothing about my dogs. And I kept pushing and pushing and pushing and fighting and calling the prosecutor, the police officers constantly to find out what the case was looking like, if they were going to press charges. And finally, the head of the prosecutors had a meeting with me for 45 minutes. And that entire time, she sat there and told me how everything was my fault and that in no way, shape, or form would they ever press charges against him for killing Kirby. And she was telling me that that day with Kirby, it looked bad that I didn't get help or do anything to stop him. And when I told her that he held me hostage the entire day, she looked at me and shrugged her shoulders and said, well, and dealing with the system, I was just being met with a wall. And so I figured I still have power. And so I filed a civil lawsuit against him. And it went on for about a year. But we did win the lawsuit, which was a huge victory. And my abuser now owes me $162,338.32, which is a huge feat because especially with individuals suing another, that often doesn't happen, that you win, especially that large sum of money. But as you touched on, as you said, the wheels of justice are still turning because I ended up going to another county because the pond he took Kirby to that day was in a different county. And I filed a police report there and they pressed charges and he is now facing 3 felony charges for the abuse and torture and death of my dog Kirby.
He's a criminal defendant now. Bravo, Sarah, with all of your persistence. Tell me, as you sit here today talking to all of us, what do you want people to know, whether it's someone just interested in helping and showing support to the movement, other survivors who've been in situations like yours? What do you want people to know, please?
I would say for people who haven't experienced this before or are just beginning to learn about domestic abuse and animal abuse, I would say just listen and be present and be open to learning, because quite often I think people shut down and don't want to hear about the truth. But this is the reality and it happens to so many people and animals. And so the first step is listening and then caring and then being able to do something about it. And for other victims and survivors who might be listening, I would say just stay strong and don't take no for an answer, because everyone is going to be there telling you no and to give up. But if you keep fighting, like, there will be a way, and there are people out here who want to help you and will support you, and we have the resources. And so just keep at it, even though it's probably the hardest thing you'll ever go through, but there are resources and we're here to help.
You know, speaking of resources, Sarah, I wanted to ask you about that as well, please. What resources helped you the most when you were going through this? And was there anything, thinking back now, like that you wish you would have had in terms of a resource to help you?
Yes, so the resource that helped me was the National Domestic Violence Hotline, because the night that I escaped, my sister told me to contact the hotline, and that was the resource that got me help and got me out. And I otherwise didn't know of any resources out there. I was afraid to Google anything because my abuser said he was monitoring my texts and calls and Google searches. And so if I had known of other resources available, such as shelters in the area or the hotline, I might have been able to call myself. But I didn't know of anything like that until my sister was the one who told me.
Wow. Sarah, talk to us. You touched on this a little bit. I mean, it sounds to me like there was a prosecutor. I don't know this prosecutor, but just from listening to your story, it sounds to me like that prosecutor didn't know much about domestic violence, to have that attitude and to try to assess blame with the wrong person, the person who was the strong survivor who deserves justice. But what other barriers did you face? Like, if you would please talk to us about some of the obstacles you encountered along the way, because you were certainly not alone.
Absolutely not. And just having access to different resources was a challenge in itself. I had been through therapy previously, and so I knew to continue therapy. And it wasn't until I had gone to like Psychology Today's website and found a therapist who specialized in trauma and domestic violence that I was able to utilize that resource. And she was the one who started telling me that I was displaying symptoms of PTSD, because I didn't know that PTSD was something that anybody could experience who had gone through trauma, because you hear it's mostly, you know, veterans who experienced it. But to have that resource and have somebody who could guide me was really essential in my healing. And I would just wish that others could know or have access to resources like that, because I truly, you know, give it credit for my healing.
Yeah, therapy is a wonderful thing. I'm a huge proponent of therapy. And again, I think that's another thing that ought to be talked about more, and it can help everyone, you know, no matter what you've experienced. And when you think about trauma, you're right, there are so many different forms of trauma that life throws at us, and oftentimes we don't even realize that it is. What other obstacles, please, Sarah? What other things, you know, did you run into that was difficult? Because, you know, so many people who experience this problem, you know, might be able to relate to some of what you went through.
Yes, mostly with the criminal justice system, and having people, first of all, believe me was a huge obstacle, because often when you hear a story like mine, sometimes people will say, well, why didn't you do anything? Or this sounds like it's your fault because you didn't do anything. And in fact, several of the officers that I was reporting my story to had that reaction and questioned me as to why I didn't do anything, and told me that this looked like it was my fault too. And being told that, when you just naturally feel guilty enough as is for being powerless to stop the abuse, that was overwhelming. And then just dealing with the system as is, of having people believe me and listen to me and care about me and my dogs, was it was almost too much. And that's why I took matters into my own hand to do a civil lawsuit. But honestly, I had called the Humane Society in Chicago, and they were the ones who suggested that I file a civil lawsuit to make my story heard and matter, and potentially find more evidence for a criminal case. And that just happened after I was doing my research. And it wasn't just given to me, you know. But But looking back, I wish I would have had more access to resources for people to support me throughout the entire process.
Sure. Well, and I think nobody ever expects to be in that situation. You are a wonderful person, and that, it came out of nowhere. It almost was like, somebody who kind of crept into your life and sort of disguised the monster that he was, suddenly was, tormenting you, torturing you, your animals, literally torturing your animals. It's absolutely dreadful. And you are so strong, and you are such an inspiration. And I can't thank you enough, because the more this is talked about, the more we can, kind of identify these people and have our antennas up and know if we find ourselves in one of those situations where we might be able to go. Sarah, looking back now and thinking about the community, and for anybody on this webinar who's thinking like, I wish I could do something to help someone in the future who's like Sarah, who's going through this, what can the community do to support survivors of domestic violence? Also their animals. What, ideally, if you could, have a wish list, what would it be on it, please?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, be present. And like I mentioned before, listen. And just listen without judgment, and just be there and care for them, and just be alongside them throughout the entire process and journey, because there are ups and downs, and it's an incredibly challenging experience to not only survive domestic abuse, but go through the process of surviving, of healing, and dealing with the aftermath, and dealing with the system and the psychological effects and impacts of abuse. And so people in the community, if they just have awareness, and if they too can have awareness of the resources available to survivors and victims of domestic abuse and animal abuse that they could offer to the impacted individuals, that would be an incredibly useful tool. As we saw with my situation, my sister was the one who gave me that resource. And that's what the community can do, is just be aware of the tools and offer it to those in need.
You have a great sister. I know you don't need me to tell you that, but she gave you the DV National Hotline, and we have been putting that up. It should be on your screen, that, and also the Crisis Center North Hotline, which is available 24/7 as well. So if anybody's listening to this, if this is triggering, please, we want you to be safe and healthy and avail yourself of those resources, just like Sarah did. And in this portion of the webinar, we are talking about the impact, and you've been so great about really sharing so much of your personal experience. Sarah, would you touch on that, the impact all of this horror, has had on you? I mean, everybody looks at you, you're beautiful, smart, you're teaching students, you're changing their lives, but you went through heck and back with this.
Yeah, and honestly, it almost broke me, dealing with the system and dealing with surviving. I dealt with pretty severe depression and anxiety and PTSD. And after I got the phone call from the police department initially that said, no, we're not pressing charges, I felt the lowest of my life. And honestly, like, I wanted to die. And I say that because going through this abuse, like, I didn't have Kirby and Daisy, and I didn't want to deal with the system and the trauma. And I'm just grateful that I did have my therapist, because my next session, I told her, I think I want to go on medication because this is just a lot to deal with. And so she sent me up with a psychiatrist, and the medication helped for, a long time. And then ultimately, living in the area where I grew up in with my family was too much to be surrounded by the traumas constantly. And so I ended up moving out of state. And that's done wonders for me and my mental health, because just being surrounded by constant triggers, like, it's almost impossible, I felt like, to heal and to, do okay. And so I moved out of state, and I'm doing so much better with the help of these resources. And I've put in a lot of work over the past 2.5 years to heal myself. And sometimes it's ugly, and you go places you don't want to have to heal. But ultimately, it's what makes you better.
Yes, yes. Everybody can take a lesson from you, practicing self-care. It's so important, and we can't take care of other people if we don't take care of ourselves. Sarah, thank you for sharing all of that. And thank you for continuing your advocacy work. You're on the Pause for Empowerment Advisory Board now. I love that we're going to be able to draw on your insight, your experiences in shaping that program to help so many other survivors. Wow. Okay. So as we're pivoting into our third section of the webinar, I want to welcome in one of our incredible panelists, Kristen Tullo. She is the Pennsylvania State Director for the Humane Society of the United States. And the gremlins were in her computer earlier.
That's
and
right.
Kristen was trying and trying long before the webinar started. And we definitely mentioned that you were part of this incredible panel of experts today, Kristen. And so just want to say big welcome to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for moderating, and Sarah for sharing your story. It is incredibly powerful.
And thank you, Kristen. And we want to pick your brain. So as we kind of pivot, to the solutions, this is actually a perfect part to talk about. I mean, you are part of the solution day in and day out, and also want to get your perspective too, kind of starting with what you see from your perspective as the director, of the PA Humane Society, and when you look at what comes across your desk day in and day out, the link that you see going on between the human abuse and the animal abuse. Can we start there, please, Kristen?
Yeah, and I think it's really important too to mention that the FBI did start tracking animal cruelty crimes in their own category in 2016. So like what you heard with Sarah, the seriousness of taking animal cruelty crimes seriously, they were being lumped into an other category. But now they're broken down into 4 areas. First is animal neglect. Second is intentional abuse and torture. Third is animal sexual assault. And fourth is organized abuse, like dog and rooster fighting. And it's really important that as we're moving forward and our states are becoming fully implemented with the NIBRS, it's a national incident-based reporting system for law enforcement to be able to report data on these crimes, that's going to allow us to have an additional tool to protect victims from abuse and really look at this from a preventative approach to these issues.
Oh, that's great. This is a great starting point. We're all in different parts of the country. All of us panelists, everybody, who, or you panelists, I should say, I'm just the moderator, but you all are the experts. And I'm here for the class, and everybody on this webinar who's so wonderful to spend their time with us. Kristen, you're in Pennsylvania, and in PA, you literally are part of the solution. You and Grace got to know each other through this great group called Keystone State. Tell us about this, please.
Yeah, and I think that there is a group that we are organized called the KeystoneLINK Coalition, and it was one of the biggest needs that we saw for humans and animals in the peak of the pandemic was to really establish this coalition with a strong focus to really garner more attention to these issues, be it domestic violence, child abuse, and other forms of interpersonal violence. So by working together, we have set coalition goals to focus on 3 areas. The first area is public awareness and engagement. The second is education and training on the link between animal abuse and human violence, and that's exactly what we're doing today. And then third is a policy and practice towards promoting a preventative and approach to these issues. So we know, as an example, when Pennsylvania lawmakers enacted the most comprehensive animal protection overhaul in 2017, that since that time, 25,000 animal cruelty offenses have been filed statewide. So one goal of this coalition is to ask prosecutors in Pennsylvania to consider mental health evaluations and counseling for cases involving animal cruelty, because we know that acts of violence often beget acts of violence. And so this is a really important step that could potentially prevent future violent crimes. The second thing that we are really diving into is that as we're working for these enhanced protections on a legislative front, and is to really remember that we all have this responsibility to keep people and animals safe. And so one thing that we can all do in our local communities is to collaborate with like-minded organizations, because we know when we collaborate, our communities are safer. So something we can all do is to really start facilitating, those relationships in our communities, start that communication early, keep important contacts on speed dial, and reach out to introduce yourself, to start building, like we all on this call today, from animal protection to domestic violence, to making sure that those relationships are formed on the front end. And so I think that cross-agency collaboration and what our coalition is focused on is a really something we can all get behind in our communities.
Right, Kristen. I know that many Pennsylvanians were very grateful to you and all the work you did in helping to change the law back in 2017. You did so much to lobby for that effort and to change, what was on the books, statutorily, so that better prosecutions can be had for people who harm our animals.
That's right.
Yeah, and I guess one way of thinking about it, to kind of put a bow on it, the way I think about a Keystone Link, it's kind of like you make sure that there are links, that organizations are talking to each other, right? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah. Right. And, and I think that one thing it became really clear through our coalition is that a lot remains to be done to ensure that animal cruelty crimes are treated with the seriousness that they deserve. You heard that from Sarah. It is what Sarah just talked about demonstrates the need to take animal cruelty cases seriously, and these heinous acts of violence are a red flag for potential violent crimes against people, and the reason that they need to be taken very seriously.
Kristen, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Nancy Blaney, I want to bring you in. You've got a solution. You are the Director of Governmental Affairs with the Animal Welfare Institute, and AWI initiated something called the Safe Haven Project to help domestic violence survivors. Talk to us about that, if you would, please.
Sure. And if we could cue a slide that I've provided that just will give everyone a picture of what that looks like.
Oh, great.
Years ago, it occurred to us that you would hear anecdotally about safe havens out there, places where individuals could go, maybe with their pets, maybe not, that so many domestic violence shelters were not geared up to take care of pets, to even to send somebody to a foster, or to recommend where their pets could go for safety while they came to the shelter. So there was just a lack of awareness among the shelter community about this particular problem and the need to address it. So we started digging very deeply into all of the facilities that are out there. Our Safe Havens directory has about 1,400 listings, and they include everything from the shelters that can co-house the survivor and her animals, to entities that will provide foster care or have some sort of arrangement with a local veterinarian or a humane society where animals can be housed. So it really includes everything, because every community has to respond in its own way. And so our directory is searchable by zip code. You can put in however many miles you want to be within that, and it'll pull up the safe havens that are in that area. And again, this could be co-housing, it could be foster care. You won't know until someone starts looking into it, but it's a one-stop shopping. Because there were a number of organizations, and I give a shout out to Red Rover, to Allie Phillips, who also runs a program called Safety, where we had information in various places, but nothing that kind of all came together. This is a database that we update almost daily. It has been updated innumerable times since it first went up. I think 2011 was when we started, and it is updated all the time, because as you can imagine, information that's outdated is completely useless and just sends somebody down a rabbit hole that's not going to do them any good. This is also part of our overall animals and family violence program that provides all kinds of resources, information about funding, both for the survivors, for housing assistance they might need, for organizations to provide housing on site or otherwise provide foster care. It also suggests questions that should be asked at intake at shelters, or actually the national hotline, National Domestic Violence Hotline, uses our Safe Havens directory for information. So they provide information from that. Also provides questions for asking children to kind of suss out what might be going on in the home with regard to animals. So it's very much a very holistic approach to animals and family violence.
Bravo, bravo, Nancy. This is fantastic. Tell me, when we think about what organizations can do to help people who are experiencing any kind of abuse, of themselves, of their companion animals, what can those organizations do?
That's a very good question. And one thing I want to emphasize is that it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes there's a fear that, oh my gosh, we are going to have to undertake something bigger than we're able to do. But everybody from like Battered Women's Justice Project has a link to our website. So organizations that provide domestic violence service, child abuse services can provide a link to our website. So you don't even have to provide the service, just provide the information where to find it. And as Kristen really pointed out quite well, it's that collaborating and communicating so that organizations such as, it's kind of occurred to me, Kristen, when you said it, that the KeystoneLINK Coalition is not just about the link between domestic violence and animal abuse, it's also about the link we make among organizations and among agencies to deal with this problem. So there are many ways to just provide information, and of course with the internet and with Facebook and Instagram and all of that, information is much more easily accessible. So that's what we encourage is to provide that and to collaborate with one another within your community, so that you have everybody who impacts on families in crisis should be working together.
So well said, Nancy. Thank you so much for that. And like you said, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are great resources out there. A reminder right now before I ask my next question, want to put up those numbers. If anybody is in need of talking to someone in need of help, right there on your screen, we've got the National Domestic Violence Hotline number and also the 24/7 number for Crisis Center North's hotline. So there they are on your screen right now. I want to talk about what survivors can do to keep their pets safe at the time of exiting an abusive relationship. We know how dangerous this time can be for survivors, for their pets. Dana Friday, I want to tap your expertise on this one, please. What can survivors do?
There are so many suggestions for keeping survivors' animals safe in these situations. I could go on forever, but I won't for you guys. But there are some really important ones. And of course, number one, which you have very well stated on and on, is to call your local domestic violence center or your child welfare center or your elder protection center in your local area. Very important. And if you don't have those numbers or you don't know who to call, you can call that national hotline number and they'll direct you. And many of those services and referrals are available, just like Nancy had said. They have great resources about where you can go and how to keep your animals safe. A lot of those safe havens and other organizations do a lot of things to help you. Some of them, like that we have in our center in Pittsburgh, we have a great situation that we had gotten funding from the Department of Justice through OVC, as Grace had mentioned. And we offer things other than pet-friendly shelters for victims to come to, but other things like if there's an emergency situation, you can get to a pet-friendly hotel. So you're allowed to bring your pet with you to keep that pet safe. If you have a place to go, but you can't take your pet with you, we have collaborative relationships with people or places that board pets, or foster organizations that will keep the pet safe while you are figuring out, so you're safe and your pet is safe, or when there is animal abuse in the home and the pet needs that safety and the person is working to get out of that relationship. We have veterinary funds to help them, tangible pet store gift cards, relocation funds to help people pay for that first month's rent, to be able to escape that abusive situation, to help them pay for utility payments, moving expenses. If they're staying at the home and they have an order making the abuser leave, to get security cameras. Transitional housing options. We are so fortunate now to have 4 clients that we are helping pay for their rent, and we subsidizing their rent so that they are able to now live without their abuser, because as we know, there's a lot of financial abuse that goes on in these situations. You need to formulate a safety plan when getting ready to leave with your pet. What kind of things are those? There's so many, but some of the more important ones. Make sure you have all of your important documents for yourself and your pet ready to go, including vet records, extremely important. Keeping emergency provisions for you and your pet to take with you, but also in case your abuser starts withholding money, how are you going to get these? Keeping evidence of the animal and person abuse, such as pictures of injuries, medical records, names of witnesses. Really my favorite, which is very odd, but it being in this profession, safety plan is to establish a code word with a friend or a family member. So if you really need help and you need to have someone call the police and you're unable to at that situation because the abuser is present, to be able to share that code word and get help immediately. You also need to formulate a safety plan after separation from the abuser. Some suggestions would be not to take that pet to previously frequented areas, to install security systems like cameras, alarm systems, outside lighting systems wherever you do go, and of course, well, to change your veterinarians or places that you go for pet stores. But very important to take that pet off of social media, because those are our favorite pictures to share. But if you look around the pet, you see where they are, things like that, to really keep a safety plan going forward.
That is all such great information. One follow-up question I thought of for you, please, Dana, when you were talking about how you want to keep that evidence, and I think like a prosecutor still, even though I'm no longer one, but we know evidence is really important in being able to see these cases to the point that these people get locked up. In my mind, I kept thinking, okay, what would be a good idea? If you keep evidence on your phone, sometimes we don't, these people are going to go through phones, they're very suspicious. What do you think about sending it to a trusted friend, maybe by way of email, and go into your email and delete your sent items? So that, what do you think? What's the best way? Have clients asked you about this? I'm just curious in terms of preserving all that stuff.
I haven't really had anyone ask me that in court, which is interesting. I think it's because people think that their phones are secure, but just as Sarah said, that is a major tool for abusers to control someone. They put things on your phone, even if they don't take it, even if, if they don't know the passwords, they put spy material on phones. Extremely important to have information about that, taking your phone places. But I think your idea is fabulous, and I'm actually going to use that from now on when I talk to victims.
Good. Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah,
really
great.
Happy to help.
To do that, to take those pictures, send them off to someone who you can trust. It is, as Julie said, that evidence is extremely important in time to come for a lot of different reasons, and also for your safety plan that we'll talk about later, with protection from abuse orders and criminal charges being brought.
Oh, awesome. Dana, thank you so much for all of that. It's scary stuff, when we think about this, and here we're all about solutions. So I'm glad we're coming up with them even on the fly here. Officer Nikki Thompson, I want to tap into your expertise here when it comes to solving problems. We know there are great organizations out there that want to help, want to provide resources to people. You know, you're really in the trenches seeing things. How do you think best organizations can offer their services to people or make people aware of what's out there? Because I think part of the problem is, you know, somebody finds himself in the unimaginable situation and not knowing where to turn, maybe having heard ever before of some of the programs that are available. How do you think we can kind of solve that problem to get that safety net out there and widely known?
One of the biggest things to do is to talk to all of the social service agencies that are in your community, whether it's a county or a city or in your local town. You can think of it as a bullseye and just, you know, go down as small as you want. But if those social service agencies are linked to each other in some way, it provides more information when a person says, well, I found this is where I need to go to. They may be able to refer them to yet another organization. We've partnered with a few different organizations in Bucks County to help offer what we call our safe holds, which is saving animals and families during emergencies. So that if a person does need to have a place for their animals to go while they're staying at a shelter or going to live with somebody, our domestic violence groups know that they can refer their clients to us, our shelter, to assist with the animals. But having that relationship with those social service agencies prior to somebody coming to you is just one of the biggest things you can do.
Really is. Officer Nikki, thank you for all of that. If we can please talk about, you know, this is something that has come up in many, many cases that we're aware of. And in our discussion, I want to say it was Sarah who might have mentioned it, or perhaps Dana as well. And in different states, they call them different things. In Pennsylvania, for instance, protection from abuse orders, or PFAs, other states restraining orders. But you know, what we know they are, you know, it's a civil order that can be enforced. There can be criminal penalties if somebody violates it, but oftentimes we see these cases kind of as companion cases to the criminal domestic violence case in the court system. And in Pennsylvania, we know there can be a lot more done for pets when it comes to these orders. I say we because I'm licensed to practice law in Pennsylvania. That's where I was a prosecutor. So I'm in Georgia now, but I know, speaking from, you know, somebody who's been there, Dana and Nancy, I'd love to have you both kind of tackle this and what might be able to be done here. Dana, let me start with you, please. When you're with victims at various hearings, I mean, at any point, maybe you're at the application process for one, maybe you're at the magistrate court hearing for a criminal case. What are some of the things you think that can be done legally to get better protection for our animals on these orders?
Yeah, Julie, I always get frustrated with this because Pennsylvania is a little slow, you know, to the race, which is okay. But Pennsylvania law does not specifically address protection from abuse or, as you said, restraining orders that include animal cruelty or use of that companion animal in a way that we are discussing here. So how can we do that in Pennsylvania and other states? You know, I think Nancy has a lot of information about that, do it. But here we do have in our petition to request relief, there is a section, it's a narrative section where the plaintiff can that's the plaintiff is the victim, describe what has been done and what has happened and why they need protection. And in that part of the petition, they can use it to explain to the court the intimidation and control that the defendants are asserting over that victim through the use of his or their pet. And what happens in Pennsylvania is you can only get a protection from abuse order if you are in fear of bodily harm. So advocates and who are helping people fill out their petition and lawyers working on getting protection really need to be aware of that bodily injury level, because it's important to describe how that intimidation is really making them fear for their lives. We do have a House bill in Pennsylvania right now that allows the court, that would allow the court to grant protection orders or approve a consent agreement that include granting temporary ownership of the pet to the victim, preventing contact with anyone taking care of the pet, or forbidding any abuse or threats of the abuse to the animal, so that if those were violated, the protection from abuse would be violated, and potentially that defendant could go to jail because of these things. But of course, we don't have any of those right now. But that bill does exist. And I think that looking at other states who do have those kind of protections is really helpful to show what we can do. Now, the Pennsylvania legislature, though, very interestingly, has recognized some connection between the lethality of an animal being killed or being threatened to be killed by an abuser with that lethality safety concern for a human being. We do have in our PFA law that requires an abuser who has either killed or threatened to kill a pet to relinquish their guns and weapons. So that is extremely encouraging that the Pennsylvania legislature has acknowledged that there is a connection between killing an animal and possibly killing a person by making that person relinquish their guns and weapons.
Amen. That's very, very critical, as we all know. Dana, thank you for that. Nancy, you are based in our nation's capital. You certainly bring a national perspective to this conversation. Talk to us, please, about what you see in terms of the difficulties legally with these restraining orders or protection from abuse orders, please.
Well, first, I have got to say I am flabbergasted at what Dana just said. That Pennsylvania has actually a provision to do that. It really just sets me back on my heels, because Pennsylvania would be the last place I would just expect something like that to happen. So I'm going to write that down and take that to other states. But as you mentioned, 37 states and the District of Columbia do have specific provisions that allow pets to be included on protection orders. We have not had a lot of success in finding out how this has worked across the country. We do have a couple of bits of data from Minnesota and New York, however, that show a huge spike in protection orders being awarded after they passed their laws allowing pets to be included. So we know that this is something that domestic violence survivors are looking for. So very, very important. There are also states that either or and also include animal abuse as an element of domestic violence. So kind of speaking to what Dana was talking about, so that this can also be a grounds for action, because this is a piece of domestic violence definition. Why this is so important now to be able to include pets on protection orders is because the same law under which CCN got its great grant also changes federal law, so that now it is a federal offense if you cross a state line to violate a protection order that includes a pet. If you are accused of stalking across state lines to threaten a pet, that is now a federal offense. There's also a federal provision for restitution. So this has really been elevated quite substantially in those cases where an order can be provided. So we are working very closely with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys to get everybody on board with this, and so that other people will not go through what Sarah went through, finding prosecutors who just do not get it. And that's a very big thing on our agenda, is just to make sure prosecutors do get it, and that's training is important for that as well.
Very well said, Nancy. Thank you for that. And let me say, many, many, many of them do get it. And there are many of them that really care. And unfortunately, Sarah ran into some of these prosecutors who just obviously didn't. But now, hopefully, these prosecutors who are in the neighboring county are going to do things the right way. We just have a couple of moments left, but one, I think, really important question we can sort of end the solutions segment on is pet ownership and how that can potentially become an issue with abusers. Dana Friday, let me turn to you, please, being a lawyer too, and you touched on this a bit in what to have when you're exiting, the ownership information established, you said the vet records. You know, what are some of the things that everybody should be aware of when it comes to ownership rights and how that could play out later on?
And every state is different. So that's something important to talk to a lawyer in your own state. Just because when you leave, one of the most important things is for that victim to be able to take their pet, right? So ownership is extremely important. In Pennsylvania, unfortunately, our pets are property, just like a toaster. So you need to look at ownership of that toaster. How do you get ownership? As you said, Julie, exactly. Taking registration and license, veterinary records, microchip records, pedigree registries, all in the name of that survivor, all of those kind of things. Also talking about if there's a transfer of ownership agreement, make sure you have that. We do have laws in Pennsylvania about tattoos, branding, microchipping, but otherwise that civil property law applies, which is just like a toaster. One thing that people, when they don't have certain like county licenses or whatever, is to make sure you keep, as we talked about, all of recent photos, all videos you have of that survivor with the pet. Very important, again, because this could end up in a civil lawsuit. List of witnesses who can provide information to support that the survivor is the owner. Unfortunately, you know, Pennsylvania, again, is treating them as property. Hopefully that'll change too. We do have another law that is, I know it exists in other states, which would recognize that companion animal as a living being, an essential part of the family. It should be not considered as a toaster or a piece of property. It would allow, of course, to recognize agreements of possession and care of the pet when you take them. Right now, those agreements can't even be upheld. And, you know, and also if there is an agreement, there is no way for the court to say, hey, what time was spent with the animal? Is the animal acquired prior to or during the marriage? What's the financial responsibility of the person caring for the animal? What are the needs of that animal? So that law that is pending would address those things, but of course that is in our domestic relations law. So if that was even passed, it wouldn't even apply to somebody who wasn't married. But so those documents that I talked about and those pictures and those witnesses are really important for survivors to compile. But every person should check with their states, with attorney in their area to see what is the status of the law of ownership for their animal.
That's really excellent advice, Dana. And I thought of another follow-up for you, please. Thinking along the lines of what you said about safely compiling this, would it be a good idea to get these things to a friend too at some point? You know, sure. I keep thinking maybe go to a public library and use a computer there if you need to scan in documents and make copies of things or something, maybe something like that. This way, if you have to leave quickly, you're not rummaging around looking for things and drawing attention to yourself.
Absolutely true. Yeah, and that would be important. I don't know, you know, and at the time that if you're leaving, that is something we know that those abusers are using the animal for intimidation and saying a lot of times, like, you go ahead and leave, and I'll have your animal. I'll be keeping that animal, and what I do to that animal will be my choice. Right there is intimidation and control. So it is really important to do these things, compile these things sort of secretly, like, you know, you're implying, getting them maybe done, scanning them, great idea, and sending them off to someone to keep them just in case you need to leave quickly.
Dana Friday, thank you so much for all of that. These solutions are fantastic. Didn't I tell you we had a power panel today for you, and we are so glad you are availing yourself of these resources. We want your questions at this point in the webinar. We want to open up to what you would like to ask our experts. So there on your screen, take a look at all of the various solutions and organizations that you can reach out to, read up on, get more information on, and we're going to go to our question and answer session at this point in the program. I believe I saw one question about pet insurance and whether or not that is a good thing to have. I believe this is from Nick, who's over in the United Kingdom. Nick, thank you for this question. And Kristen Tulu, let me bring you in on this, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot on this. And I'm wondering if you perhaps have heard this question before about pet insurance. Is it a good idea to have? Why or why not, please?
Yeah, I am a big proponent of pet insurance, especially kind of as it relates to, the webinar today. You just never know when you might need that emergency assistance for your pet. And so 100%, I fully would recommend, if you have pets, there are some great insurance companies out there. The Animal Law Conference actually had a whole segment on this a few years ago. So Nick, thank you for that, because perhaps that's something that we could have on this upcoming 2023 Animal Law Conference agenda again.
Yes, that would be so great. So Nick, you heard it from Kristen Tulu. Take her advice. Pet insurance, a great idea. Thank you for that question. Let's see. This is a comment, but want to read this. This comment said, quote, Sarah, I saw your story on TikTok. Thank you for sharing it again here. So big thank you to that listener. I wish I had it. Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have a name on that? If I'm going to ask our assistant, Michael Brayak, who's facilitating this webinar, Alyssa Flannery. Alyssa, thank you so much for that comment. Sarah, would you like to say anything to Alyssa in response?
Just thank you. And that when I talk about support that I've received throughout the past 2.5 years, through sharing my story online and through people like you who hear my story and care, that means everything. And that has been like such a huge factor in giving me strength to continue this fight. And so I very much appreciate you being here and your support for everyone who has supported me.
Sarah, thank you. Here's a comment from Michelle McDyer. Michelle says, quote, I think we need more training around victimization and why didn't she just leave? And prosecutors, law enforcement not believing survivors or blaming them. Yes, Michelle, yes. That's such a big question. Why doesn't this person just leave? But leaving can be really, really dangerous. And who can I put on the spot for this? I hate to just kind of, but if you don't mind, please, Dana Friday, let me put you on the spot for this one, please. It's not as easy as just leaving, as Michelle is recognizing right there. You talked a lot about the safety plans. We hear statistics that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that isn't the most dangerous time for a survivor when they exit the abusive relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk to our clients, telling them, when that is served, that's when you really need to have like those pet-friendly hotels, because sometimes it might be a good idea to have the pet-friendly hotel, move service, have them served with the order, because a lot of those orders have eviction. Those orders have custody of children. It makes people angry. They lost control. Domestic violence is extremely complex. It is very complicated. It's someone that you love and you trust who is abusing you and abusing something that you love more than anything. Well, maybe as much as your children, maybe a little less than your children, but somebody who's taking your something you love and using it against you. And it's very complex. It's not simple at all. When there is someone that is going to be served with a warrant, or even with notice of a hearing that that you filed charges against them, it is extremely dangerous. That is the point again where we say, let's find you and your animal a safe place to go. And then in the meantime, maybe if they haven't been arrested yet, let's work on those cameras at your home from an eviction. And if that person is coming and violating that protection from abuse or violating that no contact order, then you know that you need to stay away longer for safety. So it is a very dangerous time for sure.
Most definitely. It's a tough thing to understand. I think unless you've experienced it or know someone who's experienced it, or you're working in the domestic violence prevention movement, it's really hard to kind of wrap your mind around all of the different layers at play. I mean, I say all the time on Court TV, domestic violence cases scare me more than cases with gangbangers. They really do, because these people, they act charming. They're so phony. They put on a totally different face in public than they do in private. In private, they act like maniacs. And so much of the behavior is so calculated and sick and sinister. It's really hard to understand how people can behave this way and to protect ourselves from them. And if we find ourselves in those situations, how we can safely remove ourselves from them, because it's trickery. It's all, to me, it's trickery, the way they act. I want to call for more questions as well. Please type in your questions. Let us know what you would like our expert panelists to answer for you. I want to bring back in for some more commentary and some big thank yous. Grace Coleman, the Executive Director of Crisis Center North. Grace, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie. I just wanted to once again thank our funders at the Pittsburgh Foundation and our funders in Washington at OVC, and to all of the panelists that shared their knowledge and expertise, and a few people that you can't see today, Michael Brayak, who's doing technology behind the scenes, and Victoria Graziano, whose parents are joining us today. So I want to give a big shout out to them because they raised the best kid ever, and to thank them for all of the help that they've given today.
And thank you, Grace Coleman, because this would not have happened if it weren't for you and all of the hours upon hours you put in facilitating this, building it, putting it together so that we're not just talking about the problems that we know exist, we're talking about solutions and coming together. No matter where we are in the United States or abroad, this is a problem that affects all of us. And I want to give a special thank you to all of you who've come on to attend this webinar. And for those of you kind enough to stay till the end and fill out the evaluation on the webinar, we really thank you for that. Are there any more questions or anything that you would like to know about, or in particular you'd like to ask our panelists about? Please send them in. Let's see, oh, this is wonderful. I'm going to read this comment here while we're calling for more questions. Quote, finding all of you today has just given me so much hope. Thank you all so much for everything you do. And that's an anonymous comment, but we thank you and want you to know that there is hope. Grace Coleman, let me toss it over to you. How would you like to respond to that comment of that webinar attendee today?
Well, I would like to say to that individual that there's always hope and there's always help, and that there are many of us out there, many that you can't see in various states, working really hard to keep that line of hope open for all. So lots of people are spending their days creating solutions, and we hope that that individual will reach out in their local community to find someone there to help.
Beautifully said. And please send us your questions. We still have a couple of minutes left. We want you to feel like you're walking away with really valuable information today that you can use. That's our goal, to show you this is a safe space with tons of information and resources for you to avail yourself of, and your friends and loved ones, family members, whoever it might be who's affected. And perhaps I may just kind of go down our panelists, if you all don't mind, just for a quick final goodbye comments, and just to kind of close this out today. Kristen Tulu, may I begin with you, if you don't mind, please?
Yeah, sure. I think that today what we heard, it's about research and data. It's not just anecdotal, and that link between these issues, they are related to one another. So I think it's really important that if I think as the adage goes, if you see something, say something, and report suspicious activity to state and local and state law enforcement.
Isn't that the truth? Officer Nikki Thompson, you are law enforcement. Your final thoughts, please.
I just think the most important thing is never give up hope. If you find the first person that you ask for help isn't able to provide it to you, or doesn't take you seriously, continue on, because there are plenty of people out there who will believe you, and there are plenty of people out there that want to help you and your animals. So even, just keep trying. Always keep trying, because there's always a way out.
Exactly, Officer Nikki, just like Sarah Manos did. Sarah, let me turn to you. Your brief final remarks, please.
Just thank you for being here and for listening. I know, like with my story especially, it's devastating to hear. And so I empathize with people who are hearing my story. And so just thank you for caring about us and our mission. And we appreciate you profoundly.
We appreciate you. Nancy Blaney, may I ask you for quick final thoughts, please?
Of course. First, a big shout out to Grace and her crew and the whole of CCN, who just do amazing work. Shout out to the KeystoneLINK Coalition, who is really coming together to make change in Pennsylvania. And, just to note that the tide has really turned. The tide has turned from years ago when our communities weren't talking to one another, and now they are, and we're prosecutors are talking to us, and veterinarians are getting on board. So I'm so sorry for the difficulties that Sarah faced, but her experience will inform going forward, and things are changing. Things are getting much better.
Yes, they are. And this webinar is going to end in just a moment, but you're going to see pop up on your screen an evaluation form. We thank you in advance for filling out that form, and thank you so much for attending this webinar. If it doesn't cut us off with the audio here, I'd like to get very quick final remarks from Dana, and then end with Grace Coleman, please.
Real quickly, I just would say that I really think the collaboration is so important. I just think the education into every single aspect of any pet ownership, even people that work at a bank, anywhere. And if I could please quote Kristen's something she said that I love, and if I will use, but I will promise I will quote you if I'm allowed. Collaboration makes community safer. Love that statement. Wrote it down, and I would like to end with that. Yeah.
Yes, that's the truth. We love that. And Grace Coleman, last but certainly not least, I want to get your final thoughts, please.
I just wanted to say thank you to Sarah. She's been a wonderful addition to our Pause for Empowerment Advisory Board, and I think it takes a lot of courage. I just want everyone to know that every time a survivor shares their story, it comes at a price, and she was willing to pay that price today for all of us to create hope for others. And Julie Grant, an awesome job once again. We thank you also for all of your support on the Pause for Empowerment Advisory Committee and all the many opportunities you bring. Thank you, Julie.
Oh, you never have to thank me. Thank you for letting me be a small part of it. Love you, love the Pause program. I've loved this experience today. You ladies are such an inspiration. Also smart and beautiful and kind-hearted and doing so much to help with these problems. So thank you for being our expert panelists. And thanks to all of you wonderful attendees for giving us so much of your time on this Friday afternoon. We're so grateful for your ears listening and everything you're going to do going forward. So for all of us on the webinar, we say thank you so much. Please stay on, and you should receive the evaluation in just a moment. Take good care.
Hello, everyone. I just want to follow up for that evaluation. It should be coming to you just directly post this meeting. And thank you all for coming.
Michael Brayak, thank you for everything you've done during this webinar and prior to and organizing it. You've been tackling all the technology today, and we couldn't have done it without you, so thank you so much.
All right.